Rich people don't create jobs. Rich people, i.e. wealthy people, own all the stuff that we need to survive because over several hundred years, they have enclosed all of the resources that we need to survive. And then they basically use that power over everyone else's survival to force people to work for them for less than what they deserve. And the only option you have is work or die, basically, like work or you're out on the street. The whole idea of primitive accumulation, of enclosure, was to create a landless class of peasants who had no choice other than to sell their labor power in order to survive. And you see this process continuing all around the world today. You know, when the state reduces, let's say, employment benefits, or when they tie your healthcare to your job, or when it becomes impossible to buy a house without an extremely large salary, when it becomes even impossible to rent without an extremely large salary, you end up in this position where you are faced with this choice of work or die, work or be out on the street. And that isn't a process that's happened naturally. It is a process that has been guided and directed by people who wanted to exploit human labor and use it to augment their profits.
Welcome back to the Better Future podcast, bringing you the people, projects, and ideas helping steer the world toward a better future. I'm your host, Michael Mez, and today we're talking with Grace Blakeley. She's an economics and politics commentator based in the UK, whose work is helping reshape the conversation around capitalism, power, and inequality. Grace is everywhere. She's often on TV in England, she writes on Substack, she posts videos on social media, and she's the author of 3 books, Stolen, The Corona Crash, and most recently, Vulture Capitalism. This episode goes deep into the myths that underpin global capitalism. We talk about how corporate and political elites work together to protect their interests, how and why governments prop up monopolies like Boeing and the big banks, and how economic freedom usually means freedom for capital, not for people. We also touch on the history of capitalism, the global legacy of economic imperialism, and how the fight for a better future is really just a fight for who holds power and what we the people can do to reclaim that power. This is one of the most fun and illuminating conversations I've had on the show, so let's get into it.
So here today with Grace Blakeley.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. I love your work, and there's so many things that you talk about that are relevant to my work and view of the world that have actually influenced the way I see the world, so super excited to dig in.
Me too. I'm also really excited to talk to you because I feel like you have a talent for taking information that people need to understand and communicating it in like a very easy to understand and like catchy way. So I want to learn a bit more about that from you.
Oh yeah. Well, happy to chat about that anytime, including right now. A theme of this show so far has been, the reason I call it Better Future is that I'd love to talk about ways that the future could be better than it feels like it's going to be, given the path that we're on now. And a lot of people tend to say that the system is broken. And you said in your book, Vulture Capitalism, that the system isn't actually broken. It's working exactly the way it's designed to work. And so I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit for us and talk about the ways in which actually what's happening is the way the system is designed.
Yeah, so part of the reason that I wrote my latest book, Vulture Capitalism, was because I realized that there was this conversation going on about the brokenness of our economic and political system, and the same answers and responses were being proposed from people across the political spectrum, right? And these were different kind of versions of the same sort of idea, which is that we need the government to do X to fix what's going on in the economy, or we need this particular policy change, or, this set of economic interventions to kind of deliver prosperity and fix what's broken. And it really struck me that this was such a fundamental misreading of the way that capitalism works, right? This idea that if you have politicians doing more things, if you have greater levels of political intervention in the economy, that inevitably means that you're in a situation of greater levels of socialism, or that the system's going to start working in a way that was fairer. All you have to do is look back to the financial crisis to see that just because a government is intervening in the economy doesn't necessarily mean that it is doing so in the interests of the majority. If you have an economy that is weighted in the interests of a particular economic elite, they're not going to be content to kind of sit over here and just govern their corporations and not worry about what's going on in the state. They're going to use their economic power to influence what is happening in the realm of politics. And that's the situation we end up in today. And it's why That analysis of the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended is so true. We live in a social system in which political and economic power is concentrated in a very small number of hands amongst political elites, technocrats, bureaucrats, billionaires, executive shareholders. And these people are working together to create systems that deliver them what they need. So it might not be working for the rest of us, but it's working for the people who are in charge.
You've spoken about how the people who have the economic and political power are actually building the future and how they can wield that power to determine what future we end up in. But I suppose the optimistic spin on that is that if we shift the power dynamics and if we shift the way that capital flows throughout the economy and the relationships between citizens, corporations, the government, that we can actually steer the future into a new direction. Is that a fair way of summarizing sort of like, we'll get into the solutions at the end of the episode, but I suppose maybe we can go into it with an assumption that the future will only be better if power dynamics change. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think I would start with the quote from Marx that men make history, but they do not do so as they choose, right? And so this is the idea that we have the capacity to shape events and shape history, but not simply by coming up with better ideas and saying, this is what we're going to do now, right? If it was possible to transform a society by understanding it so effectively and building ideas on the basis of that understanding, then we would already have fixed what's wrong, because we have so much analysis of so many different problems. And I'm not just talking about kind of big picture, economic unfairness, right? I'm talking about, specific areas of policy where everyone knows and agrees that this is not working for anyone. You can think about this in terms of, the impact of climate breakdown, let's say. You can think about it very specifically. You see it happening in the US with, money in politics. There's the classic thing of the companies that control the way you guys will do your taxes, and the fact that they basically have this huge amount of control and lobbying power. And that it's very obvious that there's a much more efficient and effective way to get people to do their taxes automatically. But these few tax companies do it.
TurboTax.
Exactly.
Yeah, they charge everyone to do their tax.
And they defeated a bill to make it simpler.
Well, it's not just a bill. The government built a free tax software under the Biden administration called Direct File. They had rolled it out. This year was actually the first year that it was available to millions of American citizens. And then it got canceled.
Yeah.
Just because TurboTax and Intuit, their parent company, walked into Congress and said, actually, we don't want you to do that. Here's a bunch of money. Please don't let that happen. And the Trump administration canceled Direct File. And now we're back to, they spent all this money building a software for it, and we're just not using it.
I think this is a great example because it's just so egregious. It's in some ways such a small thing, right? But it's just such an obviously inefficient system of process that doesn't work for anyone except basically the shareholders who own these 3 companies. Right. And it's such an obvious example of how power works and how power works against what's rational and what's logical and what makes sense. I think it's really important to understand this because, a lot of people, I think, come to the left and come to progressive politics with this sense of things aren't working very well. Yeah. And if people only understood that, if the people in power only understood that the things that they're doing aren't creating the outcomes that they want, then we'd be able to change things. And I see this all the time amongst, people who write books about, how we need to change what we're doing on the climate. We need to change the way the politics works. And it's who is the we in that sentence? Who are you writing this for? Because the people in power know exactly what they're doing, right? They are working very closely with people who have an enormous amount of power and influence and want to use that to continue to make sure that the system works for them. So if we want to change that, i.e. everyone else who's not in that kind of cabal, then you need to make those decision makers as concerned about your interests as they are the interests of the people who write the checks. And the only way to do that is to actually build power.
What you said is really interesting because it makes me think about the ways that the state needs to change the way that it passes policy. And businesses ultimately need to change the way that they do business. But a lot of people seem to believe that that would be like an infringement on freedom or an overreach of state power. And people seem to believe we do need to change the way the system works, but maybe having the government do it isn't the right solution because it feels a little scary. It's the big brother. So to what extent is this debate between like state power and freedom and individualism and this debate we're always having, especially in the United States, not really the right debate? Is it a distraction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the argument in my book, basically. We've been having this debate about kind of markets versus governments for at least a century now, basically. If you think back to, 1929, the Wall Street crash, and the Keynesian revolution that took place after that, i.e. the kind of rise of social democratic, more interventionist governments that were willing to say the market is not as efficient as we had previously thought, that it needs guidance from some central authority. That was, a step change in the way that capitalism worked and gave rise to this kind of regulated form of, social democratic capitalism that we had from the kind of end of the Second World War onwards. Neoliberalism from the 80s was a reaction to that. You had this group of economists and policymakers sponsored by very powerful vested interests who were working to undermine that idea that, you need the government to curb the ups and downs of the market cycle, to intervene, to reduce unemployment, to, reduce inequality, all those sorts of things. And, they developed this very powerful and effective free market critique of Keynesianism, which was to say that any level of state intervention will inevitably lead towards authoritarianism and will inevitably lead towards corruption and will undermine the effectiveness of the operation of the market. But in some senses, this debate between like statists and marketists was an illusion, right? Because Keynes was, obviously a brilliant economist who developed this particular critique of capitalism and provided an intellectual framework for the rise of social democracy. We didn't get social democracy because of Keynes. We got social democracy because you had extremely powerful, organized, mainly labor unions who had used the environment of, relatively high employment during the Second World War to make much more powerful and strategic demands on governments at every level. And which had used the kind of environment of growth and again, kind of lower levels of unemployment and also the threat of communism after the Second World War to say, we want these particular policies, right? It was very much to do with a shift in the balance of power that had come about as a result of a number of different economic and political changes. Equally, what happened in the 1980s, we didn't just move to neoliberalism because suddenly everyone decided, we now want the free market. There had been a whole bunch of shifts that had been taking place below the surface, most notably the rise of very powerful vested interests, particularly in the finance sector. We had this kind of slow and steady globalization of finance that was really kind of pushing and straining against the barriers and regulations that had been imposed upon it. And you had powerful vested interests sponsoring politicians like Thatcher and Reagan, Pinochet in Chile, various other people, to say we need to, end this social democratic ideology and build something new in its place. But what they really did, they didn't create free markets at all. We have now, after 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, markets dominated by extremely large and powerful monopolies, which is, the antithesis of what a free market system should look like, and governments intervening whenever they like to support the interests of these big, powerful corporations and financial institutions. There is not this clear separation between markets and states that neoliberals claimed they wanted to see. But what we have seen is a massive rebalancing of class power in favor of these particular vested interests and their allies within the state and away from working people. So, you can look at history, and this is kind of what Marxism is, right? Hegel, before Marx, this German philosopher, has this view of history as this battle between ideas. And you have a thesis, then you have an antithesis, then you have a synthesis, right? And different groups end up on top and, they battle each other through debate in the public sphere. And that's how history progresses. Marx comes in and says, no, that's not how history works. It just looks that way from the perspective of elites that are changing their ideas based on an understanding of the situation as it's changing on the ground. And what really drives history isn't ideas. It is this constant battle between different classes, different groups of people who have different stakes in the system. And when you get changes to production, to the economy, to globalization, to all of these different sorts of things, it shifts the balance of power between these horses. And that's what drives history forward. So if you want to understand how we got here and how we move forward, you need to be able to understand power and actually the way that ideas flow from that balance of power rather than the other way around.
Right. This is dialectical materialism, right? This very materialist understanding of history creates a dialectic. It's not so much the ideas that are driving the show. So again, we're going to get into how to build power materially in a moment. But real quick, before we move on from this topic, I loved a point that you made in your book about how this concept of economic freedom doesn't actually mean freedom for people. It's just like freedom for capital. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so the way that this ideology, this free market ideology was sold to us, right, was based on the idea that it would promote and expand and broaden individual freedom.
Right.
And the communism, socialism, social democracy involved suppressing individual freedom for the sake of the collective. And, the classic example of that would have been like, the USSR or something.
Yeah. And in the States, we love this idea of individual freedom. And we're so aware of the ways that the state restricts individual freedom, but we have almost no awareness of the ways that corporations are now restricting our individual freedom. And so it's like this idea of state overreach is so present in the conversation, but this idea of corporate overreach or corporate power, corporate control, isn't really visible. Ultimately, what we're doing by deregulating through these neoliberal policies and removing rules and regulations that steer corporate activity, we are effectively transferring power from a group of state actors to just a group of corporate elites who are less accountable to people, right?
I would actually go even further and say we're not really switching the balance of power between corporations and states. We are ignoring the ways in which states and corporations are working together to crush the freedom of everyone else, right? Because you will, as you say, hear a lot about the government overreaching when it's regulating, healthcare or providing you with Medicare and Medicaid, or, like imposing some restrictions on big corporations, or like regulating environmental output of these businesses. But you very rarely hear about all of the many just extremely expensive and inefficient ways that these governments are intervening in the economy, in the market, to support the interests of big business. Often in like incredibly inefficient and market distorting ways that if you were genuinely a free marketeer, you would be shocked at. Because you would be like, this is undermining the operation of the market. You're picking winners. Basically, it's corruption. Yeah. Right? And we never talk about it.
Let's shock them. Moving out of the theory and into examples, with which you have many in your book. So what are some of your favorite examples of how this dynamic plays out?
So the one that I start the book with, and the one that I think, is often the most shocking to people, is the example of Boeing. So some people will have seen back in 2018, 2019, the aftermath of the 737 MAX disasters, in which two Boeing planes nosedived out of the sky, killing nearly 350 people in two separate plane crashes. What ultimately was revealed over the course of the investigations into the 737 MAX disasters is that senior executives at Boeing had known about the problems with the plane before it went to market, and had allowed a dangerous, unsafe plane to be sold, and had basically covered up any knowledge of what had gone wrong during the manufacturing process. Not only that, but the institution, the FAA, that was supposed to be regulating Boeing, also was aware of a number of flaws with these planes. But because the industry was being governed according to a philosophy of self-regulation, which of course is the same way that the banks were regulated before the financial crisis of 2008, the FAA was regulating Boeing as a unit of Boeing. So, the regulators were inside Boeing. They were being paid by Boeing. This was the idea of self-regulation. Yes, the regulators that was supposed to be within the FAA that was supposed to be regulating it. sat within their own little institution in the corporation and were even being paid by that corporation. So it was just like the most egregious conflict of interest. Again, the parallels with the financial system before the crisis are very, very obvious. And ultimately, Boeing was charged with a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States government because it was very obvious that there had been a huge cover-up and that people had died as a result. So, you look at that and you think, okay, classic case of unregulated capitalism, greedy corporation. If only the government had been there, been more active, then this never would have happened. Except the government was there. Boeing was the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in 2018. So that meant that it was receiving vast amounts of money from both state and federal governments in the form of tax breaks and subsidies. It had massive government contracts. It was an integral part of the military-industrial complex. There was a revolving door between the senior management of Boeing and senior parts of the American state. And, ever since then, it's gotten away with it, right? It got another bailout during the COVID-19 pandemic, despite the fact that it had just been implicated in these huge disasters. And this firm has been struggling and flailing and having all of these scandals that would, in any free market system, would have killed it. But because the American government keeps riding to the rescue and saving it, that isn't what happens. It shows very, very clearly that corporate power and state power are not opposites. It's not like corporations are too powerful and the government isn't doing anything to stop them. No, corporations are too powerful because the government is consistently intervening to protect their power, right? So I really think we need to just flip the switch in terms of how we talk about this stuff. Stop talking about corporate power versus government power and start talking about elite power, actually, and how that has become so concentrated and wielded so effectively against the interests of the vast majority of people, be they citizens, be they workers, or be it life on planet Earth as a whole.
So surely those people from Boeing ended up in prison, right?
Of course not.
No?
Of course not. Did anyone end up in prison after the financial crisis? One guy ended up in prison.
One guy?
Financial crisis, yeah. And he was basically a kind of sap for all of the crimes of the financial sector.
Well, a lot of people ended up without homes.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good example of how this elite power works against the interests of the people, right? Because obviously there's big financial implications of all of these market crashes and corporate failures, which means, massive losses on paper, at least. And oftentimes the people who absorb those losses are actually just the public. Thinking of, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, obviously the 350 people who lost their lives are obvious examples. In the Boeing case, I'm sure there are others. In the financial crisis, you had, 401ks that were wiped out. You had people who lost their homes, who ended up homeless because of the decisions of financial institutions to package their loans in highly risky ways and then communicate that they were much safer in this kind of froth that was created in the financial market. And ultimately, in what came to, especially in the financial sector, you have these massive gains that are made in boom times of financiers who are raking in the profits and paying out their shareholders and getting massive bonuses. But then when things go badly, there doesn't seem to be any downside.
Yeah, it's called moral hazard. It's the idea that if anything goes wrong, you know that you're going to get a bailout. My favorite example of this, like depiction of this, actually comes from, this is going to make me seem really old, but the TV series Friends, right?
Yeah.
There's this episode of Friends where Joey gets health insurance. Joey doesn't have health insurance, and then he suddenly goes and gets health insurance. And because he's got health insurance, he's like, right, okay, I've got this bat. I'm going to put this helmet on. I'm insured now, so just keep whacking me over the head because, like, I've got all this insurance, so I may as well just, like, do whatever I want. And who cares if I get hurt because someone else is picking up the bill. This is, like, exactly what the banks were doing in the run-up to the financial crisis. Right. They were like, we're not going to have to pay any of the costs for this crash when it does happen. So we may as well keep on taking on more and more risk because why not? We're going to get the upsides and everyone else is going to have to pay the downside. And the reason that they knew this was actually because of the outcomes of both the savings and loan crisis and the tech bubble, right? So it was after the savings and loans crisis that you really started to see particularly central banks revealing their hand and showing the lengths that they were willing to go to to bail out a struggling financial system. So this looked like pushing mergers between institutions. It looked like particular forms of lending from the central bank that would kind of remove distressed assets from the market. It looked like big cuts to interest rates, which would make it very cheap for particular financial institutions, especially, to borrow and kind of get the party going again. It was the same thing that happened after the tech bubble. You know, it's this idea that like, if there's a financial crisis, interest rates get cut so low that you can basically, you know, get debt for free. And that's going to get the party going again very, very quickly. So it means that, you know, any of the losses that you do face are going to be relatively limited because people are just going to start borrowing and start investing and getting that cycle going over and over again. So this idea of moral hazard, which was basically that like whatever happens, you are probably not going to be the one that's going to have to foot the bill for this crisis, was very much embedded from the 1980s onwards. And it's actually, ironically, given that the neoliberals refer to themselves as these free marketeers, the whole idea of protecting powerful corporations and financial institutions from the consequences of their own actions has been a central part of how neoliberalism has functioned from the outset. You know, this was how we got to the point of having these huge financial markets that in some cases, you know, the assets of the banking system were like several times the size of the GDP of several countries like Iceland and Ireland and whatever. You know, you don't get a financial system that big if you have executives of, you know, big banks and hedge funds and, you know, all of these other integrated institutions worrying about what's going to happen if things go wrong. The only way you can convince people to continue to borrow and invest and extend themselves is if they believe that when the shit hits the fan, which it inevitably does, they're going to be protected. And so that's, you know, it's a cornerstone of the neoliberal transformation of our economy. It's been a cornerstone of financialization, of even, you know, globalization, right?
Yeah.
It's, you know, convincing these firms that if they expand, if they grow, if they take more risks, they're going to be okay. And it's been how profit, how wealth has been sucked up to the very top of our economy at the expense of everyone else. Because everyone knows that in a crisis, the more power and influence you have, the better you will be protected.
That's right. This sort of flies in the face of a very common adage in Western culture that rich people, billionaires, for example, deserve their wealth because they've taken so much risk.
They don't. They don't. Like, think about the risks that you take as someone who is in insecure work, like living paycheck to paycheck. You maybe take out a mortgage. You know, you're leveraged up to the hilt because you can barely afford to get by. The risks that you take by just existing are that you're constantly going to find yourself on the brink of bankruptcy, the brink of losing your house. Like, you know, if you lose your job, you could lose your healthcare. You could literally die, right? If you are a, you know, wonderful, brilliant entrepreneur and you manage to build a successful business that, you know, comes to dominate the market in which you operate, the whole point of you having got to that point is that you have been able to insulate yourself from risks. You know, this is like a kind of thing they'll teach you in Management 101. It's like avoid competition, avoid the pressures of the market, create a moat around your business, find ways to undermine your competition, like buy up your competitors, which is of course what all the big tech companies do. Create close links with, you know, financial institutions, with politicians that can protect you when things go wrong. And then even in the case that things do go wrong, you've got limited liability. So if your business goes under, you're not going to be out of your house. Like, you're just going to lose your business. And then, you know, 5 minutes later, you can start another business and do it all over again.
Right.
So the idea that capitalism rests on the kind of sweat and tears of these bootstrapping, risk-taking entrepreneurs is absurd. The people who take the risks in a capitalist society are the ones who go out to work every day, knowing that they could be fired at any point, knowing that they could have their debts called in at any point, knowing that they could lose their healthcare, everything that they've worked for at any point. And the whole, like, impetus for the kind of corporate power shift that we've had since the 1980s has been taking away the one form of power that those people did have, which was the power to organize and the power to come together and say, if you hurt one of us, you hurt all of us. That was the only power that working people had in this system. And neoliberalism was entirely geared towards destroying that. It wasn't about free markets. It wasn't about shrinking the size of the state. It was about divide and rule, about making sure that the people in charge were able to control everyone else, and there was nothing that they could do to fight back.
While we're debunking some of these common cultural myths, I've got a few more for you. Little segment here. Let's deconstruct the cultural hegemony of the ruling class and talk about some of these myths that uphold the power of the ultra-wealthy. So, another one. Rich people create jobs, so we should all be grateful to rich people.
Rich people don't create jobs. Rich people, i.e. wealthy people, own all the stuff that we need to survive because over several hundred years, they have enclosed all of the resources that we need to survive. And then they basically use that power over everyone else's survival to force people to work for them for less than what they deserve. And the only option you have is work or die, basically, like work or you're out on the street. And the way that we got to that point was through basically dispossession. It was like...
Yeah, the history. Do you want to just briefly touch on the history of enclosure? I mean, that's a big one.
Yeah, so, this is what Marx and Marxists call primitive accumulation. It's a very important understanding of the way that capitalism developed, right? Because the liberal story of how capitalism developed was that we were all, in our little huts, and we all decided that we were going to start... One person decided that they would start making shoes, and another one decided they were going to start building boats, and they wanted to trade with each other, but there weren't any markets. So thankfully, we all figured out how to trade with one another, and then we created capitalism, and that was all really nice. Of course, that isn't how capitalism works. It's not really based around markets.
It sounds funny when you...
I know, it's absurd, right? It's just, that's what they teach you in economics 101. Capitalism is not a system.
The bankers come along and they printed some money for us, and then we all got to live under the abundance of the global financial class. Thank you so much, bankers.
Before that, we were just completely... What were we doing? We were just throwing shoes at each other, being like, give me something back for this. All I can do is make shoes. It's completely absurd. But it's important to understand what actually happened, because it really helps to expose the fact that capitalism... The central thing that makes capitalism is not markets, it's capital. And what is capital? It's basically your control over the means of production. So the stuff we need to produce everything. Now, historically, of course, that was land initially. And the enclosures were a process whereby previously common land that was used to kind of graze cattle amongst villages and was kind of held collectively was enclosed into, private hatches. And it meant that basically people who had previously relied upon subsistence to be able to survive were no longer able to rely on subsistence to be able to survive. And this was another thing that was planned. What ended up happening, of course, was that at the same time, you had the rise of industrialization. So you had big industrialists who needed workers, but workers were not willing to leave their places where, life was extremely hard, but they were rooted in their communities and, they had ways of living, our traditions, etc. And they weren't willing to kind of give all that up to go and work for an extremely meager wage, and also a highly significant chance of death or injury or, whatever in these early kind of industrial systems. So what happened was they were forced off the land. The whole idea of primitive accumulation, of enclosure, was to create a landless class of peasants who had no choice other than to sell their labor power in order to survive. And you see this process continuing all around the world today. When the state reduces, let's say, employment benefits, or when they tie your healthcare to your job, or when it becomes impossible to buy a house without an extremely large salary, when it becomes even impossible to rent without an extremely large salary, you end up in this position where you are faced with this choice of work or die, work or be out on the streets. For us, that choice is stark. If you're living in the global south, it's even more stark. You have to find someone who will hire you, or you will die, because the resources that you previously relied upon which were rooted in community, and the relationships between people within that community and the land have been broken down over this long historical period. And that isn't a process that's happened naturally. It is a process that has been guided and directed by people who wanted to exploit human labor and use it to augment their profits.
In some ways, it was the origin of the dynamic that you write about in your book, of the combination of corporate power and state power,
100%.
capitalist power and state power.
Yeah.
It was decreed that this land was no longer common. It was no longer for the public. It is now owned by a wealthy person near you. Therefore, you must head to the city, grab a job at the local factory, and work 7 days a week until you
lose an arm or a leg, or just die, or can no longer work anymore.
So that was the origins. In fact, didn't y'all invent that here in the UK?
We sure did.
Wow.
That was what Marx was writing about. He was like coming over here, and this is, Marx was someone who was reading about the work of people like, for example, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who were these early theorists of capitalism. And he took their work, which talked about the amazing power of the market and how you would have a baker and a butcher, and the invisible hand would, equilibrate supply and demand in this amazing way and lead to wealth and power and riches and innovation beyond anything that we could have ever imagined. And he read that and then looked at the kind of dark satanic mills that were springing up across England and saw the absurd just juxtaposition between this vision of capitalism with this wonderful force that would lift us all out of the gutter, and then people without arms and legs and children working in factories and dying at age 7 just to create this extraordinary wealth for this industrial class. And of course, spread over the whole world, you see that come up in colonization and slavery, just like the wealth and power that is extracted, wrung out of the labor of other people.
And this, I think, maybe explains the process of the global reach of capitalism and the fact that now we can't imagine anything different, because eventually this process of enclosure got too big for just England.
Sure did.
And the machine needed some more material. And so it expanded through the process of colonialization to most of the rest of the world. I mean, it wasn't just England at that point. There were a few European colonial powers who were spreading the good word, so to speak. But ultimately, the global South has become a ground of a source of labor and material for, the quote unquote imperial core, the global North of basically the founders of capitalism. And ultimately, in many ways, the labor and material costs of the global South countries get forgotten in our current cultural context, because they're not so close and we don't see the suffering, we don't see the poverty. But to some extent, none of this would be possible without the constant appropriation of resources from the global South into the global North, which is really, a driving force between capitalism to its day. And we don't call it colonialism anymore, but maybe we should.
Yeah, neocolonialism is what some theorists have called it. And it all starts again with this marriage between capital and the state. If you look back to how this process began and spread beyond the borders of England, colonialism had existed up to that. But this system of expropriation geared towards profit reached its kind of early high point with the East India Company, which was a kind of joint venture between a merchant class and the British state. And it confounded a lot of the early theorists of capitalism that this is how the corporate form would emerge, right? Adam Smith looked at the East India Company and called it a strange absurdity, because he was like, this isn't how capitalism should work. He was like, this is a state in disguise of a corporation, basically, because the East India Company was effectively able to govern large parts of India as a state would. It could, levy taxes and punish people, but it was all geared towards basically maximizing value for shareholders, though it would have been called something different at the time. It's geared towards extracting and generating profits. And the input to that was, of course, the theft of resources from the Indian subcontinent, but also the lives and the labor of the people who lived there. Not to mention the destruction of a highly sophisticated political and economic system, the destruction of an entire society, basically. And again, this is something that took place based on an agreement between powerful capitalists and politicians, basically, and bureaucrats, between political and economic elites who realized that in order to continue to generate the kind of profit that they had become used to over the course of the Industrial Revolution, and indeed, even before that, to kind of consolidate and reinforce the power that this same class of people largely had as feudal lords, they would have to extend and expand their power over to, what they would have considered to be the kind of ungoverned and uncivilized classes of the rest of the world. And that process is, continued to this day. If we think about that alliance between capital and the state with a view to maximizing profit that can be sucked back into the imperial core, there's loads of examples that I look at in the book. A relatively recent one, which I think is still really pertinent, is a case of what is now known as the kind of investor-state dispute settlement, basically. So this is a kind of settlement process that's written into a number of investment treaties, which basically says if a government party to this treaty introduces legislation that harms a company's profits, that company can sue that government, right? So it's a kind of a process that protects profit generation from democracy, effectively, from popular power, right? And uses imperial power, i.e. the force and weight of American control of the economic system, to underpin that. And there's a case that I talk about in the book, which was Chevron in Ecuador. There was a huge oil spill, and a bunch of Ecuadorian plaintiffs came together to say this oil spill has led to birth defects, caused cancer, caused all these sorts of health problems, and we want this company to clean up after itself. They won that case. Chevron was ordered by an Ecuadorian court to clean up after this oil spill. But instead of adhering to that, it fled the country, took all its assets, and launched an investor-state dispute settlement against the government of Ecuador, saying this ruling is harming our profits, it's creating a hostile investment environment, your judicial system is corrupt, we refuse to pay. Not only did they win, but the lawyer who was representing
Steve Donziger,
was hounded and harassed, subject to house arrest, lost his legal license, right, basically because of a corruption in the American legal system. Because this company was able to wield so much power that the Ecuadorian government lost this case, and Chevron won, was protected. And justice has never been served. And this happens over and over and over again. There's so many cases of these investor-state dispute settlements always being settled against poor governments in the global south, right? The only, governments generally lose, but when governments win, it's rich governments. It's just a very obvious case of imperialism, basically. And it continues to structure the way that the world economy works to this day.
I have a couple more myths for you to debunk before we talk about how to solve this. Cool. If you work hard enough, you can also be a billionaire.
Okay, two things. Firstly, no. Oxfam has done a report recently that shows that 1/3 of billionaire wealth comes from inheritance. So unless you have a rich parent, no. Another third comes from crony connections to government. So basically corruption, or if you happen to be the nephew of the guy who runs the state oil company, then you might end up running the state oil company, and then you can become a billionaire. And the other third doesn't come from those two sources, but that's the rest of the billionaire wealth that we know, which obviously comes from the back of exploiting workers and exploiting the environment. Think about Jeff Bezos, for example. Where does his wealth and power come from? It comes from the fact that Amazon workers have to wander around these warehouses all day, picking up parcels off shelves, delivering them, being subject to measuring and monitoring that is kind of just like Orwellian in nature. If they get an injury, if they like collapse on the floor and die, there have been cases of people just dying on Amazon warehouses, having heart attacks, and people just stepping over the bodies because they can't stop the working of this machine. So Jeff Bezos's wealth comes from that extraction and exploitation and oppression. For there to be a Jeff Bezos, there has to be millions of other exploited workers that exist to create the power and wealth that he is able to benefit from. So, it's basically like...
So we can't all be billionaires?
We can't all be billionaires, exactly. And then there's this other thing, right, which is in believing that, in thinking, if I work hard enough, I can get to the top. It's not a coincidence that we all think that. Because whilst we're believing that, and whilst we're hustling and pushing each other out of the way to try and, win a promotion and please our bosses, we aren't benefiting. The boss benefits, he gets richer, and we forget that the only way that we would be able to protect our own interests would be if we stopped competing, stopped acting like we're in this kind of market Hunger Games competition, and started working together and saying, if you don't treat us with respect, then we aren't going to work for you.
We all need a raise. This morning, I saw a post by the CEO of Y Combinator, a big startup incubator in Silicon Valley, and he said, "We should have more billionaires, maximize abundance, support entrepreneurship. We should be prosperity maxing." Is it truly, are you just against prosperity and abundance?
I hate it. Look, it's very easy to just say words like we should all be prosperous, we should all have abundance. But absent an understanding of how capitalism generates prosperity for some, it is meaningless. Because the way that capitalism generates prosperity for some is by generating misery for others. You cannot have universal prosperity in a capitalist system. Just think about like this phone, right? What has happened for me to be able to hold this phone in my hands right now? A bunch of kids in the Democratic Republic of Congo at gunpoint have been sent to scratch coltan out of the ground, which has been exported probably illegally out of the country to Rwanda, which is sponsoring those military groups to continue to fight that war, which allows all of this conflict mineral mining and extraction to take place. The government of Rwanda is supported by our government to continue to be able to do that. Those resources end up being exported, used in the manufacture of a phone like this, which is outsourced by Apple to a company like Foxconn, for example, whose hyper exploited Chinese workers have, like, maybe if they're lucky, one day off a week, they live on a compound that they share with all of the other workers. They're not allowed to leave.
They have nets outside the windows to prevent people from...
And they have nets outside the windows because people kept jumping out of these compounds, these dystopian hellholes, to try and kill themselves. So they had to start catching them with nets. All of the profit from that goes to Apple, right? And actually, it's not just that I get this iPhone. Probably, like, if I had more savings than I did, they would be invested in Apple because I'd send them to my pension and my pension would give them to BlackRock, and BlackRock would invest them in Apple. So that generates prosperity for me, generates prosperity for Apple, generates mainly prosperity for the shareholders in that company. But it comes on the back of the hyper-exploitation that's taking place elsewhere in the value chain. And it's very important to remember that the levels of profit that are generated by that company would not be possible were it not for the exploitation and oppression and violence that takes place throughout the rest of that value chain. If Apple paid its workers enough to allow them to experience prosperity and abundance, Apple would not be prosperous and abundant as they are, right? If we all were so committed to ensuring prosperity and abundance for all, we would be saying things like, right, okay, well, the government of Rwanda should probably stop sponsoring the M25 rebel groups in Eastern Congo that's, going around raping people and extracting conflict minerals. But in doing so, we would then disrupt all the supply chains that allow us to get this stuff that goes into our phones. And if we were to pay properly to allow, them to experience abundance, the people who are mining these minerals in the first place, making sure they had protections from all of the kind of horrific health conditions that come from that process, then again, it would be even more expensive.
And then Apple wouldn't be $1 trillion company.
That's it.
Tim Cook wouldn't.
And you wouldn't have a pension in
Right.
all of that stuff.
When I first read the title Vulture Capitalism, I initially thought about venture capital. Was that intentional to rebrand the term VC?
No, but I like that it has, I like that it's done that. The actual original term, vulture capitalist, is something that is used to describe these kind of investors who buy up distressed assets and then use either the legal system or their economic power to extract from the people who own those assets. So the classic example is a hedge fund like Elliott, for example, buying up the debt of a government that's about to default and then suing that government when it fails to pay its debts. There was a great example of this happening after the financial crisis of 2008. The government of Zambia, one of the poorest countries in the world, commodities prices fell because the economy was tanking. Zambia is a big copper exporter. It suddenly finds itself unable to pay its debts because of a financial crisis that had taken place halfway around the world. So an Irish hedge fund bought up the debt of the government of Zambia and then sued it. And instead of being able to provide healthcare for its citizens, it was forced to pay money to this company located in the rich world. It's the same thing that happens when, property prices fall in a deindustrialized area, let's say, or, after a financial crisis. And a vulture capitalist swoops in, buys up maybe an entire, catch of real estate, and then hikes up rents or turns it all into luxury property and sells it to international investors. All of this is basically like the use of a power asymmetry to extract from ordinary people and boost profits at the top, which is basically how capitalism works.
The last myth that I'd love to chat about before we get into what to do about it is that capitalism is the source of innovation, and that only if the government gets out of the way can entrepreneurs be allowed to innovate.
This is kind of true. Capitalism does generate a lot of innovation, or at least it has in the past. So Marx actually, one of the things that he writes about capitalism is that it unleashes this incredible force of technological development. Right. And you see an entire industry that is the industry of technological development emerge in a way that it has never done at any other point in human history. We've always been innovating. We've innovated to solve problems. Under capitalism, innovation becomes an industry in its own right. So you create new technologies and then you backfill uses for it. Right. And that is something that is unique about this capitalist system. But the issue is that the way that that process of innovation takes place, obviously, again, works to reinforce generally the interests of the dominant class. So, this process of kind of concentration that you see over the course of capitalist development means that innovation begins to take place amongst a kind of smaller and more powerful group of large corporations, effectively. And they are able to basically direct the innovative resources of our entire globe and decide what that process looks like. And it ends up with us having billionaires who say, we control all of these resources, and we're deciding that instead of coming up with innovations that would allow us to, say, deal with the impacts of climate breakdown, we're going to go and build rockets so we can colonize another planet. That is innovation, but it's anti-human innovation. So the question isn't just innovation, it's who's controlling that innovation and why.
And it gets back to the point we started with around how capital steers the future, steers us towards the future that is the most profitable for capital. And it makes me think about OpenAI engineers who are infamously worth like $100 million or something like that. Like that's where innovation is really happening in the core of the core of the capitalist system is a few engineers who have figured out how to develop these AI systems, and that is considered a massive source of pride for the capitalist economy. When
it's also why like the US empire is losing it right now, because you're losing like monopoly power over that process of innovation. People are all like tearing their hair out being like, why is Trump starting this trade war? Why is he acting so irrationally and undoing, globalization, which is something that has benefited the capitalist class for a very long time? Trump, well, namely the people who are backing him, knows that if the American empire loses monopoly power over the process of innovation, which it's had really for a very long time, and it's protected very effectively through the use of kind of intellectual property law, then it loses its dominant hegemonic position in the capitalist world system, and ultimately it stops being the single empire. And that's why we have this trade war right now. It's because China has, on a number of different levels, shown that it's able to either compete with, or in some cases outcompete, the innovation that's taking place in the US. And if that continues, China will become the technological hegemon. We're probably already getting to that point, although the US is obviously streets ahead in a number of different sectors. But in some of these kind of key cutting edge industries, China is demonstrating that it is able to undertake its own innovation and develop industries on the basis of that innovation as well. That's a threat to American capitalism.
And it seems that despite Trump's best efforts to get in the way, he's also shooting himself in the foot in respects of his allegiances to his donor class. I think the strongest example here is his rollback of trillions of dollars of investments into the renewable energy industry in the United States that were just repealed with the big beautiful bill, basically undoing a lot of the massive investments into U.S. manufacturing that were going to happen as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's not to say that the Biden administration was deconstructing the American capitalist global empire, but it was at least mindful of the importance of the energy industry and renewable energy and green energy in the future.
Another part of the whole kind of like Trump program is destroying alternative visions for the future, right? This is what, in some ways, like the whole neoliberal agenda has been about. And whilst Trumpism is a kind of break with that in a lot of ways, the continuation lies in the importance of crushing collective power and crushing potential alternatives. So the point is that you feel scared. The point is that you feel hopeless. The point is that you feel disempowered. Like, the whole psychology of Trumpism is basically saying the powerful are the ones who are in charge. They should be respected. They deserve to be in the positions of power that they have because they're better than you. They've competed to get to the top, and you should respect that. And you cannot challenge them. If you have a vision of a green future in which we all have prosperity and abundance and whatever, that's a fairy tale. If you have a vision of coming together to demand higher wages, of course, he's attacked the NLRB. That's something that you can't do. It's about enforcing order and hierarchy and saying, this is the way the world is. We have created it in this way, and it cannot be challenged. And, you know, the violence that is meted out on anyone who tries to resist that is the flip side of that. It's like, if you resist, you could lose your job, lose your education, be deported, right? This is a big part of why we're seeing this mass reaction against pro-Palestine activists that we're seeing here in the UK as well. You're a terrorist now if you support some pro-Palestine organizations. This is the response of an elite class that is terrified about the general power and popularity of alternative visions for the future and needs that to be crushed in order to maintain their monopoly over just the way we think about the world.
In many ways, I think it could be argued that this is what's been happening the whole time since the beginning of the neoliberal era, but now the lights are on, and we're just saying it. The quiet part is being said out loud, and I think Trumpism is just, there's no beating around the bush. It's simply, no, you don't have power. Shut up about your alternative vision of the future and fall in line. And I think many would argue that this has been the case for the last 30 or 40 years, and potentially even longer than that, and that Trump is just saying the quiet part out loud. But what can we do about it? So I want to end this on a more practical and prescriptive note. Despite the best attempts to prevent us from dreaming up the better future, and despite the best attempts to prevent us from organizing to bring that future about, we are still here, and we're going to talk about it. So if there was one thing that you would change to maybe be a domino, to start to fall, bring things towards falling in the right direction, are there any things that come to mind in terms of practical policies or shifts that you would implement to sort of get the ball rolling into a future where we actually can organize and fight these forces?
I would get everyone in a union, and I would make it a lot easier for people to form unions, to have new unions, to join existing unions, to organize. I would remove all of the barriers that exist towards organizing in the labor movement. And in doing so, basically give people a sense of their own power in the economic system that could be translated into power in the political system, and act as a kind of, like a domino effect for other forms of political organizing.
Why? What is it about unions that excites you?
So it's not like particularly unions that excite me, because I've got a lot of problems with the way that unions work. What excites me is workers organizing. So people understanding that they have power over our economic system because they're the ones that produce the value. And then coming together and realizing that if they unite, they can not only disrupt that economic system, but actually build something new. Now, I don't think that that's the only form of activism and organizing that's important to allow us to move beyond the kind of system that we have now. But it is the one that, not coincidentally, the powerful have spent the most time trying to crush and make illegal and make impossible and make ineffective.
And that's probably because there's the most historical evidence of it working.
Exactly.
People who work in large organizations may have an easier way to imagine what forming a union could look like. But a lot of people, these days, they're in the gig economy, they work multiple jobs. Maybe they are, like us, they're independent people speaking online and making a living doing that. Typically, when I think of a union, I think of, United Auto Workers, these big corporate workforces who actually can, by not showing up and taking their job in taking their position in the factory, they can actually cause the gears of the corporation to grind to a halt. But I think for a lot of people, it's hard to even conceive of the idea of joining a union because they're not in this workplace where that type of traditional union is available to them. So I guess one is that one of the strategies of the capitalist class to prevent this from happening, and two, is there a way around that? Or something people can do? Can we have a union for progressive economics communicators?
100%. I mean, I'm in a union. I'm in a few unions. Yeah. We've actually been organizing recently as part of the Society of Authors, which is kind of
authors
representation for authors. And, the idea is basically to make that into a more politically progressive organization. But, in terms of what are the ways that the labor movement has been made less effective? It's basically all been about divide and rule. And that divide and rule has looked differently in different places. When I say I want everyone to be part of a union, I'm not just talking about obviously us in the rich world. I mean a big part of the reason that capitalism still functions is because in the places where most of the stuff is produced, it is either illegal or effectively impossible for the working class to come together and form unions. Either because they live in authoritarian systems where unions are illegal, or because the barriers to doing that are so significant that it just doesn't happen. So, that would be a huge step forward if the actual workers of the world, the people who produce all of the things that you need to survive, were able to unionize and demand their fair share. That would already, just in one fell swoop, lead to a massive rebalancing of power on a global scale. So the fact that that can't happen is a huge, huge barrier. And it's not a coincidence that that can't happen, because the whole process of globalization was designed to take that production process and move it somewhere where workers were easier to control. If you think about the great battles that took place over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s between industrial working classes and their bosses, the end point of that was to say, they started by saying, machines are coming for your jobs. The workers then organized and said, well, we want to have some influence over how that process works. And then eventually they were able to just say, okay, well, we're going to move your jobs somewhere else and replace the ones that do exist here with, new technology, right? And that bargain, that fight was only won by capital again, because the state stepped in and fought against the unions on behalf of the bosses. This is what happens. What all of the battles of the 1980s were about. It was about breaking the organized working class in the rich world so that that work could be moved somewhere where people were easier to exploit on the one hand. And then for us, the other part of that divide and rule strategy was what I've been talking about, which is to break up collective consciousness amongst ourselves and instead convince us that we're all mini capitalists. And we all have our 401ks and our little houses, and we are asset owners, and we have to invest in our human capital and hustle and compete against one another. And your sense of identity and self-worth is tied to where you end up in that market game. That's a really effective way of convincing us that we cannot cooperate because we have to compete.
So how do we break that illusion? Because I do think that's how a lot of people perceive themselves. And to your point, it's not really like ideas that necessarily change the world. It's more this shift in material condition. And so I wonder what would be an actual material change people could make, maybe listeners of this podcast, for example, to stop behaving or seeing themselves as a mini capitalist and start to behave and view themselves as what even to call it, as a member of a collective that has economic power and agency and the ability to steer the ship.
Yeah. So this process, what you said about how, ideas don't necessarily shape material conditions. It's not, I don't think that's simple, right? I don't want to, I'm not going to argue that history is this great battle between ideas, because that's not what I believe. I do believe that history is driven forward on the basis of first, the transformation of production, and then the battle between these classes that shapes how that productive system ends up working. But that class battle is shaped by the way that we think about that process. Otherwise, there would be no point in, any of us existing and doing the work that we do, right? That sense of solidarity that workers have in the past had with one another is so powerful as a way of kind of fighting back against this individualism. And it's powerful in a number of different ways. Firstly, because obviously, today, if you can't afford to put food on the table, you will probably blame yourself, say, I'm, worthless and useless, and then be like, okay, well, I need to go and take out a high interest payday loan to be able to put food on the table. If you were part of a group of workers who had solidarity with one another and who you trusted, you would be able to go to them and say, are you guys also having this problem? I can't afford to put food on the table. They would all come together and, you would say, right, here, we need to demand a higher wage from our boss. And this is indeed what has happened historically. So there's a very obvious material sense in which that shift can be beneficial. And it's not just in old style, unionized industries. We see this happening now in the US with Starbucks workers. We see it happening in Amazon warehouses. We see it happen with delivery drivers, with, Uber drivers, whatever. There are lots of different ways to build that sense of solidarity. It doesn't have to come from just a traditional union model. But that material shift is really important. The second shift, and I think this actually flows often from taking action when it comes to your economic conditions, is that you begin to realize that collective power, solidarity, mutual aid are the only things that we really have that can protect us. Because there's this idea, right, that you can protect yourself from the ups and downs of the market. You can build your 401k, you can have your house, you can have a big pension pot, you can, fight to create this moat that you can build around yourself that will protect you and your family from this extractive, exploitative system. And that's what we've all really bought into over the course of the last 50 years. It's you save, you protect yourself. It's not the state's job to provide you with a social safety net. It's your own job. You take the risk, you get out there, you be an entrepreneur. And as soon as you start realizing the way in which that way of looking at the world, that ideology is what allows you to be exploited. As soon as you realize that when you come together with people who are also in the same situation as you, and you can fight back and demand to be treated with respect and to have the basic things that you need to survive, you then start to see all the ways in which that kind of competitive, individualistic ideology is screwing you over in every other area of your life. you see this in communities, right? I like to think of neoliberalism as dividing us along a number of different ways. So instead of workers, we see ourselves as entrepreneurs. Instead of citizens, we see ourselves as consumers of public services. And instead of communities, we see ourselves as households. So we don't have a stake in what happens in our places. We don't care about, the devastation of our natural environment. We don't care about our public goods. We don't care about our neighborhood. And that allows those at the top to exploit those resources, to dump sewage in our rivers, to basically destroy our collective infrastructure, because we're all just focused on our own little household. We're not focused on our wider community. It's the same thing with our democracy, right? We think of democracy as something that we do once every 4 years. You go, you vote, and you hope to get something in return. You don't think of it as this process whereby you're coming together with other people who share your interests to really shift power and demand that those in charge can be held accountable for the decisions that they've made. So this shrinking of our sense of self to just what happens in my own individual little life, it allows those at the top to just take so much from us, all the way up to our sense of belonging and community and mutual support.
Yeah, that might be a keyhole into this whole shift, is actually sharing with your neighbors and your family and thinking it's not so radical to say, let's have a community kitchen in our neighborhood.
Yes.
Let's take care of each other's kids. And instead of all having to pay this incredibly, quickly rising cost of private childcare, let's find a way to manage that communally. And when there is some sort of, political project or environmental issue in our neighborhood, let's all show up to the meeting and actually go and give a shit about it. And I think that that's where just participating in your local community is sometimes the first step towards deconstructing a lot of these ideas and cultural myths that neoliberal capitalism has embedded.
100%. Yeah. It's radical, right? And it's funny because you'll see people on the right saying there's been a decline of community. We don't look out for each other anymore. The social bonds that used to tie us together are fraying. And it's because we've all been encouraged to view our lives as markets, to view ourselves as commodities or as entrepreneurs competing within those markets. And you don't have ties of solidarity with fellow competitors.
So you're saying it's not because of immigrants?
Shocking.
Because that's what the right keeps telling me.
No, I mean, that whole narrative as well has been so powerful in embedding that, right?
Yeah, it's like they name all of the right problems and then they tell you it's because of immigrants or because of trans people.
Yeah. It's powerful and it works, right?
It's so simple. It's in many ways simpler than participating in all of these community activities. It's easier to play.
100%. Because if you, the point that we've ended up at today is you're your own individual little entrepreneur. You're competing with everyone else. You know that this system is rigged against you and you feel completely powerless because you're not part of a union. You're not part of a political movement. You're not part of a neighborhood. You're not part of anything that could defend you against the people who actually are in positions of authority over this entire system. So you internalize that sense of powerlessness. You think, all I can do is protect myself, shut yourself off even more from the people around you, and then start to act with suspicion and fear with regards to everyone else who could take that stuff from you. And instead you think, I'm going to vote for someone. I'm going to put my trust in someone who says, I will protect you and you alone. And I will protect your individual little world that you've constructed for yourself. And I won't ask you to share or to change things or to try and fix things or to engage or to lower those walls that you've built out of this process of fear and fighting all the time. I'm just going to allow you to keep fighting and keep struggling, and I'm going to attack the enemies that get in your way, migrants and trans people and benefits scroungers and whatever. It's a very easy form of politics to engage in when you are coming from a place of fear and scarcity. So moving beyond that, this is why, again, I think participating in these movements is so important, because you cannot move out of that place of fear unless you feel what it means for someone to be in solidarity with you. You cannot believe in a politics of collective power and mutual aid until you have experienced what it's like not to feel like everything is on you and you have to fight to survive.
The last solution that you've talked about a lot in your book, so I just want to quickly touch on it before we wrap, is the idea of embedding democracy in everything we do. This is probably a solution to a lot of this idea between, like, should we have more state power? Should we have more corporate power? Ultimately, what we need is more collective control over institutions. And so is this why you identify as a democratic socialist? Is basically this idea of embedding democracy into government, into corporations, into communities? And would you encourage people to consider democratic socialism as a pathway towards solutions? Or
Yeah, absolutely. We've ended up with this view of socialism as the state takes over the economy and controls it. And that comes from one interpretation of Marxism, which ended up becoming the historical reality of socialism, state socialism. But if you read into Marx's work, there is an alternative, and I would argue far more convincing, understanding of what it means for workers to take control of the means of production, which is not the capitalist state basically seizing control over the economy. It is workers becoming so well organized that management ceases to be needed. This is what started to happen in the 70s, was that workers in particular firms came together, they were organizing so effectively that not only were they able to kind of bargain with management over wages and conditions, they started to say, we want seats on boards, we want to be able to have some control over the management process. And ultimately, we could run this firm ourselves, we do not need to be managed. You still see this happening in lots of different parts of the world, in Italy and Argentina, places where there is this tradition of like worker organizing, but maybe not a particularly effective state. Workers just take control of where they work, and they build communities around that. They build mutual aid and mutual support, and they continue to run these firms effectively and produce things, but there is no management. They own these things together. You see this as well with certain parts of the kind of worker cooperative movement as well. So that kind of vision of a society in which you don't have this divide between everyone who owns all the stuff and makes all the rules and people who are forced to take those rules, obey, and work in a way that those in the top demand, is a vision of true democracy, really.
Yeah.
It's democracy that is realized not just in the realm of politics, where you vote once every 5 years and, you get a choice between two different colors of what is basically the same political vision, extending the principles of genuine representative democracy into the realm of the economy. And in doing so, making real political democracy possible. Because when you have concentrations of economic power of the kind we have in the system in which we live, real political democracy is not possible.
And we might actually be able to solve some of these absurdities of the current economy, which are that we all see these things that we obviously ought to do, which would definitely be better for society, but we don't seem to be able to do them because there is no real democracy in the way these decisions get made.
Exactly.
So a democratically governed economy would be a solution to that.
Mm-hmm. It's, I would argue, the only solution.
Probably the only solution. And that's what democratic socialism is.
Exactly.
Well, Grace, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great chatting to you.
Let's fix this thing. A lot of the ideas are in Vulture Capitalism. So I encourage everyone listening to this podcast to check out the book. And
workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
You make great videos on social media too.
Not as good as yours, but I try.
Well, hopefully this is the beginning of a collaboration.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
If you want to dive deeper into Grace's work, I've linked her Substack, her social profiles, and her latest book in the episode description. Vulture Capitalism really is a must-read. And if you liked this episode and want to hear more conversations like it, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Substack. I've linked all of those in the description below as well. Sharing this episode with a friend who's interested in power and capitalism, that's the single best way to help this show reach more people. Thanks for listening. And as always, stay curious, stay hopeful, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.